The war is usually dated to a single morning. Before dawn on the 25th of June 1950, North Korean artillery opened fire across the 38th parallel and columns of Soviet-built tanks rolled south toward Seoul. Within 3 days, the capital had fallen. Within 3 months, the United States, fighting under a United Nations flag, was committed to a land war in Asia it had never planned for. And within 6 months, China had entered the conflict directly, turning a peninsula the size of Minnesota into the first place the Cold War killed people in large numbers, rather than in theory. That is the story most documentaries tell, and none of the individual facts in it are wrong. North Korea did strike first. Kim Il-sung did seek Soviet approval before he moved. But treating the 25th of June as the beginning of the war, rather than its final and most violent chapter, erases 5 years of decisions made in Tokyo, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, and it erases a peninsula split in half by two American colonels who had roughly 30 minutes and a National Geographic map to decide where the line would fall. The war's real starting point was a partition nobody in Korea was consulted about, financed, armed, and made survivable over the following 5 years by choices about industry, land, electricity, and above all military budgets that rarely make it into the standard telling because they are less dramatic than tanks crossing a border, even though they are what made the tanks possible. Most retellings spend far more time on the 3 days it took Seoul to fall than on the 5 years it took to make that collapse possible in the first place. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a line drawn in a single evening in August of 1945 still defines the most heavily militarized border on Earth, you have to start with what Korea actually was before that evening, and what 35 years of Japanese colonial rule had turned it into. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910 and ran it for over 3 decades as an integrated, closely managed part of its imperial war economy, extracting resources and labor with the same administrative precision it applied to the home islands. The northern half of the peninsula, rich in coal, iron ore, and hydroelectric potential, was built up into a genuine industrial base, with chemical plants, steelworks, and the enormous Supang hydroelectric dam on the Yalu River, at the time one of the largest dams anywhere in the world. Forced labor conscription, particularly intense during the final years of the Pacific War, fed Japanese mines and factories across the peninsula, and colonial planners deliberately concentrated heavy industry in the north, close to Manchurian coal and iron, while the milder, better-watered south was developed as the colony's rice basket, its harvest shipped north to feed Korea's cities and across the sea to feed Japan itself. Colonial-era investment left roughly 4/5 of the peninsula's factory output and electrical generating capacity sitting north of what would later become the parallel, a lopsidedness that had nothing to do with which half of the country would prove more populous or more agriculturally productive after 1945. It was decades of deliberate colonial engineering. By 1945, Korea's north and south functioned as two specialized, interdependent fragments of a single Japanese industrial system, wired to depend on each other and on Tokyo, and neither had been built or intended to function as a separate state. Then, in the space of a single evening, that machine was cut in two. Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945 arrived faster than Washington had planned for. Soviet troops, who had declared war on Japan only a week earlier, under the terms agreed at Yalta, were already pouring into Manchuria and northern Korea, while the nearest American forces sat on Okinawa, hundreds of miles away. Late on the night of the 10th of August, two young War Department colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were handed roughly half an hour to propose a line that would let American troops formally accept the Japanese surrender across part of Korea before Soviet forces simply occupied the entire peninsula unopposed. Working from a National Geographic map in a Pentagon office, with no Korean representative present and limited first-hand knowledge of the terrain, they settled on the 38th parallel, largely because it was a clean, round line that placed Seoul, the historic capital and the seat of colonial administration, safely inside the American zone. It was conceived purely as a temporary military convenience for accepting two separate surrenders, not as a political border. Stalin, to Washington's mild surprise, accepted the line without objection, partly because Soviet strategic priorities in the autumn of 1945 lay in Manchuria and Eastern Europe, and partly because Moscow calculated, correctly as it turned out, that whichever government eventually took power in the north would serve Soviet interests regardless of exactly where the parallel sat. Within days, an improvised wartime expedient, drawn without consultation and without any economic plan behind it, had split rail lines, power grids, coal supplies, and even individual family farms directly down the middle. The political chaos deepened within months. At the Moscow Conference in December of 1945, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain agreed on a proposal for a four-power trusteeship over Korea, lasting up to 5 years, meant to prepare the peninsula for eventual independent government. It triggered mass protests instead, since almost no Korean political faction wanted continued foreign administration after 35 years of colonial rule, and it briefly united nationalist opinion on both sides of the parallel in opposition, until the Korean Communist Party in the South abruptly reversed itself and endorsed the plan after new direction arrived from Moscow, a shift that hardened the emerging split between a nationalist right, aligned with Washington, and a left increasingly viewed, correctly, as taking its cues from Soviet policy. Joint Soviet-American commissions meant to implement trusteeship collapsed repeatedly through 1946 and 1947, and by that September, Washington referred the Korean question to the newly formed United Nations, whose temporary Commission on Korea was blocked from entering the Soviet zone entirely. After months of deadlock, the Commission voted to proceed with elections only where it could actually operate. The vote, held in the South in May of 1948 under UN observation, produced the National Assembly that elected Syngman Rhee and formally established the Republic of Korea that August, a process that gave the Southern government genuine international legitimacy while guaranteeing that Korea would emerge from the trusteeship crisis as two governments instead of one. The 5 years that followed looked less like a quiet Cold War standoff than two rival nation-building projects racing each other, each backed by an occupying power operating according to its own economic logic. In the North, Soviet occupation authorities moved fast and moved hard. By March of 1946, a Provisional People's Committee under Kim Il-sung, a 33-year-old former anti-Japanese guerrilla who had spent much of the war in the Soviet Far East, had pushed through sweeping land reform. Roughly 1 million hectares seized outright from Japanese landowners and Korean collaborators and redistributed to tenant farmers without compensation. Major industries, mines, banks, and the factories the colonial period had concentrated in the North were nationalized within months. It dispossessed the old landowning elite almost overnight, and it was genuinely popular with the roughly 3/4 of the northern rural population who had farmed as tenants under Japanese rule. In the South, the United States Army military government took a far slower path, wary of disrupting an already fragile economy, and reluctant to alienate landed and merchant elites who now formed the most experienced governing class available on short notice. Meaningful land reform in the South did not arrive until 1949, and even then it proceeded through purchase and gradual compensation rather than confiscation, a slower, messier process that fed real resentment among tenant farmers watching the North redistribute land within months. The economic result by 1948 was two starkly different starting positions. The North entered statehood with a centralized, industrially rich, freshly land-reformed economy under firm one-party control, while the South entered with a collapsing currency, inflation well above 100% annually, chronic food shortages despite its farmland, and an economy still wired to depend on a northern industrial base and electrical grid it no longer controlled. That dependency became a weapon almost immediately, and it is one of the clearest examples of the economic partition driving the political one rather than the other way around. Roughly 90% of the peninsula's electricity generating capacity, including the enormous Supung Dam, sat north of the parallel, a legacy of colonial industrial planning that had never accounted for a political border running through the middle of the grid. Through 1947 and into the spring of 1948, as relations between the two occupation zones soured, North Korean authorities repeatedly throttled electricity supply to the south, and then, in May of 1948, cut it off entirely, plunging Seoul's factories, hospitals, and streetcars into blackouts with almost no warning. It was one half of a partitioned industrial economy, using literal physical control over shared infrastructure as leverage against the other half, months before either side had even formally declared itself a separate government, and there was nothing abstract about it. Those declarations came within weeks of each other that same summer. The Republic of Korea proclaimed in the South in August under Syngman Rhee, a 73-year-old independence activist who had spent decades in exile in the United States and returned as Washington's preferred candidate after a UN-supervised election the North refused to participate in, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea proclaimed in the North the following month under Kim Il-sung. Both governments claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula, both dismissed the parallel as an illegitimate foreign imposition, and both, almost immediately, began preparing for a reunification each believed only its own side could deliver, whether through political subversion, guerrilla infiltration, or eventually outright force. What followed was a slow, grinding, and remarkably violent prelude that most retrospective accounts compress into a single sentence about tension along the border. Between 1948 and the outbreak of full-scale war, the 38th parallel saw hundreds of documented armed clashes, some involving battalion-sized units with mortar and artillery support, particularly around the Ongjin Peninsula, a narrow finger of land jutting north of the line that changed hands in local fighting on more than one occasion, and that some historians have argued may have been the actual first point of contact on the 25th of June itself, before the wider offensive began. Inside South Korea, Ri's government spent 1948 and 1949 crushing a series of armed leftist uprisings, most brutally on the southern island of Jeju, where a rebellion against the government's policies and the counterinsurgency campaign that followed killed tens of thousands of civilians over more than a year of fighting, and in the port cities of Yosu and Suncheon, where a mutiny among soldiers ordered to help suppress the Jeju uprising instead turned their weapons on the government, triggering mass arrests, summary executions, and a purge of the officer corps that Ri used to consolidate loyalist control over his own army. By the conventional start date of the war, both Korean governments had already spent roughly 2 years fighting undeclared, low-intensity conflicts against internal insurgents, cross-border infiltrators, and each other along the parallel itself. The peninsula in the spring of 1950 was two armed, ideologically committed, and already blood-soaked states, each with a leader publicly committed to reunification by force if necessary, waiting on their patrons in Moscow and Washington to decide whether, and how, to let that shooting scale up into something neither side could contain on its own, not a quiet standoff waiting for one dramatic invasion to break the silence. Those patrons were making that decision through the unglamorous mechanics of military budgets, and this is the part of the story standard accounts tend to compress into a single dismissive sentence or skip entirely. The United States withdrew its last combat troops from South Korea in June of 1949, leaving behind a training mission, the Korea Military Advisory Group, numbering only a few hundred officers, and a Republic of Korea army that Washington had deliberately kept light on offensive equipment. American policymakers, wary of Syngman Rhee's own repeatedly and publicly stated ambition to invade the North and reunify the peninsula by force at the first opportunity, restricted South Korea's military almost entirely to defensive equipment, no tanks whatsoever, an air force amounting to little more than a handful of liaison and trainer aircraft with no real combat capability, and artillery limited mostly to towed pieces far lighter than what the North was accumulating. It reflected a deliberate policy calculation inside the Truman administration, not simple neglect, one shaped as much by the state of the federal budget as by strategy in the abstract. Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, appointed in March of 1949 with an explicit mandate from Truman to cut military spending and balance the post-war budget, drove overall defense outlays down sharply through 1949, canceling programs, consolidating commands, and pushing the total defense budget down toward roughly $13 billion for the coming fiscal year, a figure the Joint Chiefs of Staff repeatedly warned was dangerously low relative to America's expanding global commitments. Congress, for its part, actually voted down a modest economic and military aid package for South Korea in the summer of 1949, before narrowly approving a smaller, reduced version months later, after intense lobbying from the State Department. Money that might have equipped a heavier, better armored South Korean army instead stayed home, allocated to a domestic economy still adjusting to peacetime, and to a defense establishment being deliberately squeezed by an administration trying to reconcile Cold War rearmament with a peacetime electorate that wanted lower taxes and a balanced budget, not new military commitments on a peninsula few Americans could locate on a map. At almost exactly the same moment, the calculus on the other side of the parallel was moving hard in the opposite direction. The Soviet Union, having equipped its own wartime army with the T-34 tank that had helped grind down the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, transferred substantial numbers of those tanks, along with heavy artillery, Yak fighter aircraft, and a sizable contingent of Soviet military advisors to the newly formed Korean People's Army through 1949 and into the first half of 1950. By the time of the invasion, North Korea fielded a force built around roughly 150 T-34 tanks, backed by a real air force, against a South Korean army that possessed no armor of any kind and virtually no capacity to contest the sky. This asymmetry was the direct, traceable, and well-documented product of two occupying powers making very different budgetary and strategic choices about a peripheral peninsula neither considered its top global priority, until one of them decided the balance had shifted enough to make the risk worthwhile, not a matter of ideology alone or of some inherent Soviet generosity toward a client state. Soviet advisors also helped train North Korean officers directly in armored tactics through the winter of 1949 and into 1950, giving Kim's forces a level of operational competence with their new equipment that South Korean units, without tanks of their own to train against, had no practical way to match. Soviet support went beyond hardware. Moscow extended reconstruction credits to Pyongyang through 1949 that let North Korea keep its inherited industrial base running while diverting a growing share of output toward military production, while South Korea, lacking comparable heavy industry and receiving American aid weighted toward currency stabilization rather than rearmament, entered 1950 with a fragile currency and a fraction of the North's steel and chemical output. Two peninsulas, one industrial and rearming, one agrarian and underfunded, were being built by design rather than by accident. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Into that gap stepped a speech that has become one of the most argued over documents of the entire Cold War, and one whose real significance is usually reduced to a single misquoted line. On the 12th of January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson addressed the National Press Club in Washington and described an American defensive perimeter in the Pacific running from the Aleutians through Japan and the Ryukyus down to the Philippines. Korea, along with Taiwan, sat outside the line Acheson drew that day. Acheson's actual remarks were more careful than the caricature that later attached itself to the speech. He noted explicitly that areas outside the direct perimeter were not thereby abandoned to their fate, and that initial responsibility for their defense would fall first to local populations, backed if necessary by the collective security mechanisms of the fledgling United Nations, a system that had never actually been tested in a real war. But underneath the careful diplomatic phrasing, the speech reflected a position already firmly established inside the administration and Congress, one built directly on the same budget constraints already reshaping American forces in Asia. Ground troops were not going to be permanently stationed in Korea again, and Korea's defense had been quietly deprioritized relative to Japan and Western Europe, both of which absorbed the bulk of a limited post-war military budget stretched across an expanding list of Cold War commitments. Whether or not Stalin or Kim Il-sung ever read a transcript of the speech word for word, it captured an accurate and easily observable signal about where American attention, troops, and money actually sat in the opening weeks of 1950, and that signal, reinforced by everything else happening on the ground, mattered far more to the decision that followed than any single sentence from any single address. Historians have argued for decades over how much weight to place on the speech itself, and the more defensible answer is that its real importance lies less in triggering the invasion than in confirming, in public and on the record, what North Korean and Soviet intelligence had already concluded from troop withdrawals, budget votes, and diplomatic cables over the preceding year. The decision itself was made in Moscow, and it took well over a year to arrive at. Kim Il-sung had been asking Stalin for approval to invade the South as early as March of 1949, and Stalin, according to Soviet archival cables that surfaced only after the Cold War ended, refused repeatedly through most of that year, wary of provoking direct American intervention in a wider war his own country, still rebuilding from catastrophic wartime losses, was not remotely prepared to fight. Two events in the second half of 1949 changed that calculation decisively. On the 29th of August, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, years ahead of Western intelligence estimates, ending the American nuclear monopoly and materially altering Stalin's assessment of how much risk Moscow could absorb in a regional confrontation without inviting a catastrophic response. And on the 1st of October, the Chinese Communist Party, after decades of civil war, declared victory and founded the People's Republic of China, giving the Communist bloc a vast new neighbor for North Korea, a secure continental rear area, and a pool of battle-hardened troops, including tens of thousands of ethnic Korean soldiers who had fought for years in Mao's armies during the Chinese Civil War and were transferred back across the border into the Korean People's Army through late 1949 and into early 1950, adding seasoned, combat-tested manpower to Kim's forces without a single additional shot being fired to obtain it. By April of 1950, meeting Kim Il-sung in Moscow, Stalin finally gave his approval, conditioned explicitly on Mao's agreement to support the operation and, if the situation required it, to intervene directly on the North's behalf. Mao, visiting Moscow that same winter for separate and difficult negotiations over the terms of the new Sino-Soviet alliance, gave his own assent that May, reportedly with less enthusiasm than Stalin but without meaningful objection. Between March of 1949 and that final approval in April of 1950, Stalin and Kim exchanged dozens of telegrams and held at least two documented in-person meetings in Moscow, a paper trail declassified only after the Cold War ended that removed any real doubt about who proposed the invasion and who signed off on it last. The invasion that followed in June was the final green light on a plan its architect had been pitching to increasingly receptive patrons for well over a year, not a sudden ideological impulse or a spontaneous land grab, timed to a moment when the balance of atomic power, the balance of regional manpower, and the balance of American budgetary attention had all shifted in ways the standard invasion narrative treats as background scenery rather than as the actual cause. What happened after the 25th of June is comparatively well known, but it is worth tracing quickly to see how directly it flowed from everything that came before it. North Korean forces, riding the T-34 tanks South Korea had none of, broke through the lightly armed Republic of Korea army within days and took Seoul by the 28th of June, pushing surviving South Korean units into a shrinking defensive pocket around the port city of Busan by early August. Eventually, 16 countries, including Britain, Turkey, Canada, Australia, and the Philippines, sent combat troops under the UN command alongside the Americans and South Koreans, but through that desperate summer, it was overwhelmingly American and South Korean units holding the Busan perimeter against repeated North Korean assaults. The Truman administration, having spent a year insisting Korea sat outside its core defensive perimeter, reversed course within 72 hours of the invasion, partly out of genuine alarm at the speed of the collapse, and partly because the attack was read in Washington as a direct test of the entire strategy of containment. Not a local border dispute, laid out that same spring in a still classified policy paper known as NSC 68, which had argued for a dramatic, expensive expansion of American military spending, precisely the kind of spending Louis Johnson had spent the previous year working to cut. The Soviet Union, boycotting the United Nations Security Council that month over an unrelated dispute regarding the seating of Communist China in place of the nationalist government on Taiwan, was absent when the Council voted to authorize a multinational force under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, an accident of Soviet diplomatic timing that made the war a United Nations operation in name rather than a unilateral American one. American and Allied forces, reinforced and finally supplied with the armor and air power South Korea had never been given, broke out of the Busan perimeter that September, after MacArthur pushed an amphibious landing at Incheon over the objections of much of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who considered the port's extreme tidal range and narrow approach channel to make a large-scale landing there close to reckless. When it succeeded, it cut North Korean supply lines behind the front and turned a grinding defensive stand into a rapid collapse, pushing North Korean troops back past the parallel and deep into the north by autumn. When MacArthur's advance approached the Yalu River and the Chinese border in October, Beijing, honoring the commitment Mao had made to Stalin months earlier, sent an initial force of roughly 200,000 troops across the river under the deliberately understated banner of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, a label meant to preserve the fiction that Beijing was not formally at war with the United States, in a massive, initially undetected intervention that turned a war against North Korea into a war against China as well. The front stabilized roughly along the original parallel by the middle of 1951 and essentially stayed there through 2 more years of grinding, enormously costly fighting over ground that barely moved, while armistice negotiations dragged on at Panmunjom for 2 full years, repeatedly stalled less by the front line, which had gone almost static, than by a bitter dispute over the repatriation of prisoners of war, since tens of thousands of Chinese and North Korean captives refused to be sent back to communist rule, until an armistice, not a peace treaty, was finally signed in July of 1953. The cost of confirming what NSC 68 had already predicted arrived almost immediately. Within months of the invasion, Congress approved the very defense spending increases it had refused to fund in peacetime, and the American defense budget, held near $13 billion under Louis Johnson's economy drive, was pushed past $50 billion within 2 years of the war's start. Essentially, the figure NSC 68 had proposed before the war made the argument for it in blood rather than in memoranda. Johnson himself was forced out of the Pentagon that September. 3 months into a war his own budget cuts had helped make winnable for the other side. By the time the armistice was signed, the fighting had killed an estimated 1.5 to 3 million people, the large majority of them Korean civilians on both sides of the parallel, alongside roughly 36,000 American dead and hundreds of thousands of Chinese casualties, for a peninsula that 3 years earlier had been treated in Washington as sitting outside America's core strategic perimeter and not worth the cost of a single extra armored division. Neither Kim Il-sung nor Syngman Rhee achieved the reunification each had spent the preceding years preparing for, and both used the war's aftermath to entrench single-man rule at home. Kim through a purge of rival factions inside his own party, who he blamed for the failure to win outright. Rhee through an increasingly authoritarian presidency that would eventually collapse in student-led protests in 1960, 7 years after the guns fell silent along a line that had barely moved since the war's first winter. The reconstruction that followed the armistice was itself financed almost entirely from outside the peninsula. South Korea spent the remainder of the 1950s as one of the largest recipients of American economic aid anywhere in the world, aid that alongside heavy ongoing defense spending kept the country dependent on foreign financing for the better part of 2 decades, while North Korea rebuilt its shattered industrial base with grants and low-interest credits from the Soviet Union and China, both of which used that reconstruction financing to bind Pyongyang more tightly into their own economic and political orbit. The peninsula that had been split by an administrative line and armed by 2 rival patrons spent its post-war decades being rebuilt by those same 2 patrons, on terms neither Korean government fully controlled. That last distinction is the one the standard telling most often loses entirely. The Korean War never formally ended. The armistice of 1953 stopped the shooting and fixed a new demilitarized zone running roughly along the same latitude 2 colonels had chosen with a magazine map 8 years earlier, but no peace treaty followed it, and in the strict legal sense the 2 Koreas have technically remained at war with each other for over 7 decades since. The border that exists today, one of the most heavily fortified and closely watched strips of land on the entire planet, is the hardened, permanent version of an administrative line drawn overnight to solve a surrender logistics problem, then filled in over 5 years by a colonial economy split in half without any plan for the split, 2 rival governments racing to build legitimacy through land reform and repression, a Soviet military buildup timed precisely to an atomic test and a Chinese revolution, and an American defense budget squeezed by a peacetime Congress that would spend the following 3 years and the following several decades paying many times over for the military spending it had tried so hard to avoid in 1949, far more than it is simply the scar left by a 3-year war that began with a surprise attack on a quiet spring morning. South Korea alone maintains a standing military of roughly 500,000 troops today, and the United States still keeps close to 30,000 troops on the peninsula, a permanent post-war commitment nobody was budgeting for back when the whole arrangement began, as a temporary line meant only to sort out where 2 armies would accept a single surrender. The invasion on the 25th of June was real, and North Korea bears direct and undeniable responsibility for launching it. But the war that most historians describe as beginning that morning had, in every sense that actually matters, been under construction since the moment Rusk and Bonesteel picked up their map, and its true weight sits less in a single invasion order given from Pyongyang than in 5 years of accumulated decisions about industry, land, electricity, weapons, and above all budgets, decisions made far from the peninsula itself, that together made that order survivable, winnable in the short term, and, in the end, permanent. The story usually gets told as a single morning in June. Underneath that morning it was a ledger 5 years in the making, written in land deeds, power lines, tank transfers, and appropriations bills, rather than in any one order to attack. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.